The guests were waiting. The cameras were positioned. Every member of the family supposedly knew exactly where to stand. But moments before the procession began, Zara Tindall looked at the order placed before her and refused to move. What happened next forced Charles to intervene personally. In the royal world, a procession is never simply a group of relatives walking through a doorway. Every position carries meaning. Every pause is measured. Who enters first? Who follows? Who stands beside whom? These details silently announce rank before a single formal word is spoken. That was why the change caught Zara's attention immediately. Camilla was expected to move ahead of her in a configuration Zara had not anticipated, and what might have looked insignificant to anyone outside the family suddenly felt loaded with meaning. At first, almost nothing happened. Zara did not create a scene. She did not raise her voice or challenge anyone publicly. She simply stayed where she was. An aide approached quietly, assuming the hesitation was confusion, and repeated the instruction. Zara listened. Then came the answer that changed the atmosphere. She had understood perfectly. She simply was not moving into the position she had been given. That distinction mattered. This was not presented as a fight over who possessed the grander title. For Zara, something more personal sat beneath the arrangement. Royal protocol could change with a reign. Family memory could not. She had grown up watching Queen Elizabeth II command respect without needing to demand it, and she had watched her mother, Princess Anne, spend decades serving the institution with relentless discipline. To Zara, certain relationships carried weight that no newly printed order of precedence could instantly rearrange. Then Camilla noticed the delay. The movement behind her had stopped, and suddenly the silence became heavier. Everyone understood the danger. Once the procession began, even a few seconds of confusion could become visible. Questions would follow. Speculation would spread. What was still a private disagreement could become a public humiliation. The aides tried to contain it without involving Charles. That was the safest option. If Zara could be persuaded quietly, the moment would disappear before anyone outside knew it had happened. But Zara made her position unmistakable. She would take part. She would walk. She would fulfill her obligation. But she would not enter under the arrangement she believed reduced a complicated family history to a simple question of rank. That was when the problem changed completely. Outside, everything remained calm. Inside, the machinery of royal ceremony had stalled over one woman who refused to take a single step. And when the aides realized Zara wasn't bluffing, the question stopped being where she would walk, and became why this particular place beside Camilla mattered enough for her to risk challenging the order at all. To anyone watching from outside, walking one position forward or backward might seem meaningless. Inside the royal family, it can represent decades of loyalty, marriage, bloodline, memory, and authority. And Zara's objection reportedly carried a message far more dangerous than simply saying, "I won't follow her." Zara occupied a position unlike almost anyone else in the family. She was the granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, the daughter of Princess Anne, and yet she had been raised without a royal title. That choice had shaped her place inside the monarchy in a curious way. She belonged to it completely, but she was not bound to every layer of it in quite the same fashion. She understood protocol, but she was also free enough to question what protocol was trying to say. And this time, she believed it was saying too much. Her loyalty was not built around titles alone. It was personal. She had grown up around two women who represented duty in very different ways. Elizabeth through the crown, and Anne through relentless service without ever needing the highest position. Their authority had been earned slowly, year after year. To Zara, that history could not simply be reshuffled because the monarchy had entered a new reign. That was the source of the tension. She was not necessarily challenging Camilla's official rank. She understood exactly what Camilla's position meant. What she resisted was the expectation that everyone else should instantly reorganize their emotional world around that rank as well. An aide tried to explain the distinction. The walking order, Zara was told, represented the crown. It was not supposed to reflect private affection, family closeness, or personal history. But that explanation only made the disagreement sharper. If public ceremony demanded that personal history disappear whenever hierarchy required it, then Zara believed something important was being erased. Official precedence could decide where a person stood. It could not decide what that position meant inside another person's heart. Then Zara asked the question that changed everything. Had Charles personally approved the arrangement? For the first time, the aides hesitated. It was only a moment, but Zara noticed. And in a family where pauses could speak more loudly than answers, that hesitation mattered. Suddenly, Princess Anne's influence seemed to hover over the entire confrontation. Anne was not there beside her daughter, but everyone understood where Zara's instinct for stubborn loyalty had been formed. Now, other members of the family were beginning to notice the delay. Heads turned. Quiet questions started. The private disagreement was beginning to spread outward. And once that happened, the aides knew they had lost control of the moment. But the moment Zara asked whether Charles himself had approved the order, the confrontation escaped the hands of the aides, because now only one person could answer her without making the situation even worse. Charles did not enter a shouting match. He walked into something far more dangerous. Silence. Camilla was waiting. Zara had planted herself in place. Staff were watching the clock, and within minutes, doors would open onto a public ceremony nobody inside could afford to disrupt. By the time Charles was brought into the dispute, the problem had already moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. He was told that Zara had heard the instruction, understood it, and still refused to take the position expected of her. The aides had tried discretion. They had tried explanation. Nothing had worked. Now the king himself had been pulled into a confrontation that had begun with a few steps in a procession and was rapidly becoming a test of authority. Charles's first reaction was not fury. It was calculation. He understood exactly what a visible delay could trigger. A procession that started late would invite questions. Questions would become whispers. Whispers would become headlines. And suddenly, a private disagreement over precedence could look like open division inside the family. But the danger cut both ways. Camilla was already at the center of the arrangement. If Charles changed the order too obviously, it could seem as though his wife had been pushed aside to satisfy Zara. Yet if he simply ordered Zara to obey, he would turn a family disagreement into something much colder. A monarch commanding his niece into place. Zara did not retreat when Charles approached. That was perhaps what unsettled him most. There was no visible panic, no attempt to soften her position. She was calm enough that he could not dismiss the moment as a burst of emotion. So he asked her directly what she was really objecting to. Zara's answer went deeper than Camilla. She was not denying the Queen's official status. She was objecting to what the arrangement seemed to demand emotionally, that everyone behave as though the family's history had been rewritten the instant the reign changed. Charles answered with the argument the monarchy had relied upon for generations. Succession had to mean something. Continuity required the family to adapt. Titles changed. Positions changed. Public order changed with them. But Zara pushed back at the cost of that logic. An institution could change overnight, she suggested. A family could not. Camilla remained largely silent, and that silence placed even more pressure on Charles. She did not defend herself. She did not challenge Zara. She left Charles standing between two competing loyalties: the husband who could not allow his wife to be diminished, and the sovereign who could not allow royal hierarchy to look negotiable. Then came the warning from the staff. Time was running out. Charles now had only moments to choose between enforcing the order or changing the entrance itself. And he understood the true danger at last. A command might save the procession, but it could fracture something much harder to repair. Charles could have ended the argument with a command, but instead, he made a decision that revealed just how much he feared what Zara's refusal might unleash, once the family began choosing sides. Then Charles did something nobody around him expected. He neither ordered Zara behind Camilla, nor allowed her to simply take the place she wanted. Instead, he altered the movement itself, creating a solution clever enough to save the ceremony, but controversial enough to leave everyone wondering who had really won. Charles refused to turn the dispute into a simple contest between two women. That would have been too dangerous. If he sided openly with Camilla, Zara's resistance could harden into something much deeper. If he appeared to give Zara what she wanted, Camilla's position could seem weakened at the very moment the monarchy needed to project certainty. So Charles chose a third path. The procession itself would change. The spacing was adjusted. The grouping shifted. Camilla would still retain her formal precedence, preserving the hierarchy Charles could not publicly surrender. But Zara would no longer be placed in the exact position she had objected to. She would not be made to trail Camilla in a way that, to her, carried a meaning far beyond simple ceremony. Officially, it was explained as a timing adjustment. Privately, everyone understood what had happened. Zara saw the compromise immediately. Charles had not agreed with her openly, but he had acknowledged the force of her objection. He had found a way to preserve the rules without forcing her into the precise symbolic position she had refused. Camilla saw something different. The arrangement had changed because Zara had stood her ground. That detail carried its own sting. Camilla had technically lost nothing. Her rank remained intact. Her position remained protected. Yet the institution had bent just enough to prevent another member of the family from being made to perform deference in a way she found unacceptable. Charles then made one thing clear. The matter ended there. No discussion. No private retelling. No quiet victory for either side. Once the procession began, everyone would behave as though nothing unusual had happened. Zara agreed, but agreement was not surrender. She was willing to move because the specific arrangement had changed, not because the deeper issue had disappeared. Charles knew that. Camilla knew it too. And as the family finally prepared to proceed, the danger had changed shape. The threat of public embarrassment had passed. In its place came something colder. Resentment carried silently behind polished royal discipline. The ceremony moved exactly as expected. No visible fracture. No obvious delay. No public sign that only moments earlier the entire procession had been hanging on one refusal. But the silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was loaded. Outside, everything appeared flawless. But once the doors closed behind them, Camilla was left with a much more unsettling question. Had Charles protected her position, Or had Zara just proven that royal precedence could be challenged? Camilla had walked exactly where a queen was expected to walk. No photograph showed a confrontation. No guest witnessed the delay. Yet privately, the incident had delivered a brutal message. A crown could establish her position instantly, but it could not force every member of the family to feel comfortable beneath it. When the ceremony ended, Camilla did not immediately seek out Zara. That would have turned a hidden disagreement into an open confrontation. Instead, her attention shifted toward Charles, because the question troubling her was no longer why Zara had refused. It was why Charles had chosen compromise over enforcement. For Charles, the answer seemed obvious. He had prevented a private disagreement from becoming a public spectacle. No delayed entrance, no obvious argument, no embarrassing scene. The ceremony had continued, and the monarchy had appeared completely united. But Camilla saw another side to it. A carefully arranged procession had been changed because one member of the family refused to accept her place within it. However cleverly Charles had disguised the adjustment, that fact remained. And if Zara's resistance could alter one royal arrangement, what would stop another objection from changing the next? Charles pushed back against that interpretation. This had been practical, not political. He had solved a timing problem. Nothing more. Camilla was not convinced, because underneath the question of precedence sat something far more difficult. Acceptance. Being recognized as queen by the institution was one thing. Being emotionally embraced in that role by every branch of the family was something else entirely. And that difference led straight back to Elizabeth. What Elizabeth had left behind was not only property, jewels, or ceremonial objects. She had left an emotional authority built across decades. That kind of inheritance could not simply be transferred by proclamation. To Zara, Anne, and others who had known Elizabeth first as mother or grandmother, certain symbols carried memories that existed outside official rank. That was where the issue became dangerous. A brooch, a necklace, a private tradition, even a place at a family gathering could carry meaning far beyond its practical use. Camilla began to wonder whether Zara's refusal had been about more than one procession. Was there a wider belief that symbols associated with Elizabeth should not automatically follow whoever now occupied the highest female position? Charles warned against turning the moment into a loyalty test. One disagreement, he argued, did not mean the family rejected Camilla's place. Yet the speed of his reassurance suggested he understood exactly why the possibility mattered. And already, the story was beginning to travel. Not through formal channels, but through fragments. A question asked quietly. A delayed entrance mentioned in passing. An aide saying slightly too much. And once the story reached the one person whose opinion Zara valued above almost anyone else's, the procession dispute stopped being an isolated act of defiance, because Princess Anne understood exactly what her daughter had been trying to protect. If Charles expected Princess Anne to quietly tell her daughter never to challenge royal precedents again, he was about to be disappointed. Anne understood protocol better than almost anyone in the family, but she also understood something protocol could never measure: the difference between respecting a crown and surrendering every piece of family history beneath it. When Anne learned what had happened, she did not react with outrage. She did not immediately defend Zara either. Instead, she asked questions. Who had issued the original instruction? When had the arrangement been changed? Had Zara delayed the ceremony? Had anyone outside the family noticed? Those details mattered to Anne. Once she understood that Zara had ultimately taken part, that no public scene had been created, and that the confrontation had remained behind closed doors, she viewed the incident differently from those who saw only a breach of protocol. Anne knew her daughter well enough to recognize the difference between rebellion for attention and resistance driven by principle. That did not mean she believed royal precedents should simply be ignored. But Anne understood why Zara had resisted what the arrangement appeared to represent. For her, loyalty to Charles as monarch did not require pretending every private relationship had been rewritten the moment he inherited the crown. Public duty and personal feeling could exist side by side, even when they were uncomfortable. Charles eventually raised the matter with Anne himself. Perhaps he expected reassurance. Perhaps he wanted to hear that Zara understood she could not challenge every formal arrangement that displeased her. Anne gave him something far less comforting. People raised inside the monarchy, she argued, were trained to notice its contradictions. They were taught that duty mattered above ego, yet they were also expected to treat rank as unquestionable. They were told family unity mattered, yet ceremony constantly reminded them exactly where everyone stood. The exchange exposed an old difference between brother and sister. Charles had inherited the crown and everything that came with it: authority, responsibility, and the burden of protecting visible hierarchy. Anne had inherited something else: a lifetime of duty without supreme power. She had served the institution without needing to stand at its center. Zara existed between those two worlds, royal by blood, untitled by design, close enough to understand the system, but distant enough to question it. Anne's warning was simple and dangerous. People could be forced to follow an order, but they could not be forced to feel loyalty in the way someone else demanded. Charles pushed back. Without visible hierarchy, he argued, uncertainty spreads, and in a monarchy, uncertainty could become weakness. Anne did not disagree with the need for order. She challenged what order could actually control. The family might obey Charles publicly while still refusing to let institutional rank govern every private bond. That was what unsettled him most. Zara's refusal was no longer simply one difficult moment before a procession. It now seemed rooted in something older, something inherited directly from Anne's own understanding of duty. But even Anne's support was not the most dangerous consequence, because the dispute had awakened another question, one involving Elizabeth's legacy, the women who inherited her symbols, and the objects powerful enough to turn precedents into something far more personal. The argument began over who walked first. But behind palace walls, precedence had always been about more than footsteps. It determined access, symbolism, visibility, and sometimes jewels. Because after Elizabeth's death, the most sensitive inheritance was not financial. It was deciding who had the right to carry pieces of her identity forward. That was where the procession dispute became something much larger. Royal jewels were never just expensive objects. Depending on their history, they could represent lineage, marriage, trust, rank, affection, or the approval of a previous monarch. A necklace could say one thing in public and something completely different inside the family. A brooch could be remembered not for its value, but for who wore it, who received it, and what private moment had made it meaningful. For Zara, that distinction mattered deeply. Elizabeth had not simply been the queen. She had been her grandmother. Certain traditions, possessions, and familiar symbols therefore carried emotional weight that no formal transfer of rank could erase. What the institution saw as continuity, Zara could sometimes experience as replacement. And Camilla now stood at the center of that tension. Her new position naturally brought access to symbols once associated with Elizabeth. That did not require any wrongdoing. It was part of the machinery of monarchy. But within the family, machinery could feel painfully impersonal. Whispers began to gather around one particularly sentimental piece associated privately with Elizabeth. Its financial worth was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what it represented. memory, intimacy, and the sense that some parts of Elizabeth belonged to her family before they belonged to the institution. Zara's position hardened around a simple idea. Not everything connected to Elizabeth should automatically become part of the new reign's public language. Charles understood the problem immediately. On paper, the difference between institutional property and private inheritance could appear clear. Emotionally, it was anything but clear. Anne understood why Zara felt protective. Elizabeth had been her sovereign, yes, but first and always, she had also been her mother. Camilla saw the situation very differently. To her, using symbols tied to the monarchy did not mean taking them away from Elizabeth's descendants. It meant continuing the role she had now been asked to occupy. The implication that every jewel, tradition, or ceremonial privilege had to be emotionally approved by the wider family felt like another challenge to her legitimacy. And suddenly, the procession made sense in a new way. Who walked first? Who wore what? Who entered where? Whose portrait remained prominent? Which residents carried whose memory? These were all speaking the same silent language. Transition could look like continuity to the crown, and erasure to those still grieving the person who came before. Zara had never been fighting simply to defeat Camilla. She was trying to draw a boundary around memory itself. And that boundary finally forced Charles toward a decision far more difficult than rearranging a procession. Because this time, he could not satisfy tradition, Camilla, Anne, and Zara, with one carefully timed compromise. Charles had prevented the public from seeing the confrontation, but he could not allow every future ceremony to become another negotiation. Eventually, he summoned the issue back into the open. This time there were no waiting cameras, no procession clock, and no excuse to avoid the question Zara had forced upon him. Charles made his position clear. Official events could not be rewritten every time someone objected to what a place in the procession appeared to represent. The monarchy depended on order, and order depended on people knowing where they stood. Especially in a reign still trying to establish its own rhythm, visible uncertainty could quickly become something more damaging. But this time, he spoke less like a king issuing a command, and more like a man trying to prevent another fracture inside his family. Zara listened, but she did not apologize for refusing the original arrangement. She did make one thing clear. She had never intended to embarrass Charles publicly. She had not wanted a scene, a delay, or a scandal. Her objection had been about something more difficult to explain, accepting Camilla's official place without being told that ceremony should also dictate how she felt about the family's past. That was the distinction Charles had resisted from the beginning. Now, finally, he seemed to understand it. He could insist on precedence. He could protect Camilla's position. He could require the family to follow protocol at state occasions, but he could not order affection, memory, or emotional allegiance into existence. So, Charles drew a quieter line. At official events, precedence would stand. There would be no repeated negotiations and no challenges once arrangements had been settled. But in private family settings, unnecessary comparisons and symbolic displays of hierarchy would be avoided where possible. For Camilla, it was reassurance. Her position would not be placed on trial every time someone felt uncomfortable. For Zara, it was something less visible but equally important: recognition that the institution had limits. Anne no longer needed to argue. Her influence was already there, embedded in her daughter's refusal to confuse duty with surrender. And Elizabeth remained at the center of everything. Charles had inherited the crown. Anne had inherited decades of duty. Zara had inherited memories that no title could replace. Camilla had inherited perhaps the hardest burden of all, the task of occupying a position once associated with a woman whose presence still shaped the family long after her death. That was why the procession had mattered. It had never simply been about who walked ahead. It had exposed 4 different understandings of succession, loyalty, and inheritance. And Charles's intervention had prevented those differences from becoming a public judgment on Camilla herself. Royal protocol could decide who entered first, but it could never decide whose footsteps the family still heard behind them. And perhaps that was the lesson Charles understood before anyone else that morning. The crown could command the procession, but inside the family, the struggle over loyalty, memory, and Elizabeth's legacy was only beginning.